Hello and welcome back to another live stream on this channel. Today we are indeed going to be talking all about Platonism, Christianity, and the different thoughts about flesh and identity. Warren Jew, how are you? I know you have big muscles, but you don't need to show off.
I'm good. I'm great. What I'm interested in, I propose a topic is what's the exact relationship between the mind and body inside Christianity, and whether sort of the modern mind-body duality can be traced to Christian thought, and how one can even look into Christian thought to break the mind-body duality, which I don't think is very helpful, or to propose a new way forward, rather than just having mind and body on the other side, not really interacting with each other, or even a body-hating philosophy.
Well, I think that what you talk about are perhaps a few different questions. Perhaps there's a difference between the mind-body problem and the nature of the mind and the body, because the best way to look at it is through a Platonic lens, is to think, well, is the mind and the body the same? Is there a monism in some sense, or is there dualism? Or there's also another approach to it, which is like, well, the body is evil, the mind or the soul or the spirit is good, in under the Platonic sense of the forms and the perfect forms and reaching out towards them. So I think it's very important that we separate these two inquiries into like what exactly is the relationship between the mind and the body, and also the nature of the forms, and whether flesh is evil. What are your thoughts? Where do you want to start?
I feel like what a good place to start would be the question of whether flesh is evil, because I think it's a big, and I guess it's a big stumbling block for people who are interested in Christian thought and wants to join Christianity, of its approach to the body. Because I think for our modern culture, there's a much greater embrace of body, of sexuality, of all of these things, whereas Christians, at least in the traditional view, is quite ascetic and is quite, I guess, against all of these bodily pleasures. So where do you think Christianity really stands here?
Well, I think that Christianity on this issue is not necessarily that the flesh is evil, but rather that that man through flesh can be evil, in the sense, because if we look at the situation, I think that the strongest critique of the idea that the flesh is in nature evil is that there is of course the being of Christ who is not evil, yet being in flesh. So there's that immediate kind of question of that problem. And of course, there have been people in the past who say that, well, Christ was not God, but rather God adopted Christ. And that is fundamentally based on this Platonic idea, such that the flesh was impure and then became purified. But essentially, in most general Christian thoughts, there is a general consensus, perhaps, that it would be inaccurate to say the flesh is evil or treat it in such a way, but rather that humans are evil, and it just so happens that humans interact through the flesh in a physical form, and as a result, there is that connection there.
Okay, so flesh is more a medium rather than the cause of evil. Would you say that?
Definitely. Well, I wouldn't even say it's the medium of evil. It just so happens that it's a coincidence, so that's the best way to call it, that the flesh is evil. Well, that the humans carry out evil things and humans exist in the flesh. It's just a coincidence. It's not necessarily tied into the flesh being evil.
Well, I guess I got two questions and perhaps a small objection against this. So there's a very famous passage from St. Augustine, who said that, I think, the proof of God's punishment of man and the proof of original sin is the penis. In the sense that you can't control the penis in any way. It just does its own thing. And here, then Augustine goes on, and I think he says that this is the proof of the fallenness of human nature, which is almost etched into our flesh. This fallenness and this.
Well, I think the question now is just, well, Augustine was more Platonic than Aquinas and other later Christian thinkers, so it's natural to expect perhaps this more Platonic twist, and it is true for most of Christian theology. You notice a slow switch from Platonism to Aristotelianism, and the same thing almost happens in Islamic theology, where Islamic theology, especially Al-Ghazali and Al-Kindi almost are moving towards an Aristotelian lens as well. So I think there is kind of that similarity where people are moving away from a Platonic understanding of the world into an Aristotelian understanding of the world. And Augustinian would be on that Platonic side.
Well, I guess the question then is, how can one address the problematic that Augustine identifies? And I think what he was identifying is that there are certain desires that the flesh provokes in the mind, wherein it is not really the relationship of I'm just myself and then I have evil thoughts. And these evil thoughts, it's a coincidence that I act out these evil thoughts through my flesh. But rather, the flesh itself is a cause of desire and a cause for evil. Like you can see, whenever there's war, there's a lot of rape going on. And one can even argue that the causal relationship is from the body into the soul rather than from the soul to the body. And how would one resolve this?
Well, I think the answer here, or the true question really here is, well, does humanity have a cause or a reason for, or does the mind have a control over the body, or is the mind subject to the body? And that definitely ties into the question of free will. Are our choices, are our actions purely based on materialistic drives, or are they based on are they based on actual rational thinking, or not even just rational, but just human will? And there is indeed a question between the two. And now, of course, you could raise the idea of, yes, the flesh being tied up to a lot of evil, and that's definitely true. And in fact, a lot of evil can be related to the existence of the flesh. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it follows that flesh is evil, but rather just that it follows that the flesh can lead potentially to evil, though I don't necessarily see a possible alternative, however, because in the same way you could say the flesh leads to evil, it could lead to loads of good. And unless you want to say it is both good and evil, I think the best way to say it is neutral, and that it is the being within the flesh which leads to good and evil.
So under this view, would you say that the flesh has little importance since it's neutral? Or if it's neutral, what's its importance in its neutrality? I guess the idea is, if the flesh is neutral, it's not good or evil, then why do we care about the flesh? Why are we talking about it at all?
Well, I think that the flesh is the mode of being, or at least the mode of existence, not being in the capital B sense of a Heideggerian sense, but just the flesh is the mode of being in which we exist. And as a result, we are the masters of said machine. For example, you put you run a supercomputer. It's not necessarily a supercomputer, but rather the code behind it. And in some sense, it is indeed the code which is the mind, and the supercomputer being the flesh, perhaps.
And would there be, under this view, there seems to be a great demarcation between the code, that is the mind, and a supercomputer, or the hardware, which is the body. What it seems like is there's not much a relationship. That is, we would still be the same human beings if we don't have the kind of body that we have. But if we are sent into a computer, we would still be the same thing, as long as the code is preserved. I feel like it's intuitively, I want to challenge this because it feels intuitively wrong, that somehow the mode of being of how we are, of us as embodied in a biological system, is really important for me as a human being, and perhaps even for the functioning of morality, or the functioning of the good. Because I feel like it's not for no reason that the highest ideal in Christianity is embodied in Christ, and you need that body in order for the moral ideal to shine forth. Would you agree with this challenge?
I'll say perhaps there's a bit of a confusion going on, perhaps, that perhaps a disagreement is only apparent because it appears that the flesh is useful and it's important. I can't think of humans without the flesh. You can't think of a human being without the physical, biological status of being a human being. But I would not then say that the human being as being flesh is necessarily part of what it means to carry out moral action, but rather that the moral action lies on the mind within the flesh instead of the flesh itself. And that is perhaps a difference. So it's not to say that the flesh is evil, but rather to say the mind within it is evil. And you could say, of course, that perhaps in some situations argue that the mind is indeed, that there is no kind of mind within the flesh. and maybe you agree or disagree with that. It's not really important here, I don't think. But rather, the most important thing I think here is that you're kind of suggesting, well, where exactly is evil? What exactly is evil? What is carrying out that evil act? And is that evil action or that evil being the flesh, or is it something else?
Mm-hmm. I guess the disagreement here is that I would propose a view of the mind which is not so separate. As in, it is not the mind uh, that is acting out moral action, that is doing the thinking, and that is directly controlling the body. Rather, perhaps what I want to say is that the body is intimately tied up with the mind, or rather, the functioning of the body. There's almost an identity between the intricate biological body and the mind, and they're both manifestations of different views on the same underlying phenomenon. And without the kind of body that we have, without being embodied, it is impossible for the mind. Yes, also for the mind, even if it exists, to carry out moral action. I think that would be my challenge.
Well, at this point, then, would you not then say that we've pushed the question further? We're no longer talking necessarily about the relationship of God or the relationship between the mind or humans being good, but rather we're just asking the further question, perhaps, of, well, then, now that we know that the mind or that the flesh is not evil in itself, then we can ask the further question of, well, okay, what is that nature? What actually is the relationship between the mind and the body? And I think that they are indeed two different questions. We have to approach them differently, perhaps, such that we're going beyond the mere questioning of just, well, what exactly is it, to, well, what is the relationship between the two?
Well, I would disagree here. I would say that the two questions of the first question is the mind evil or not, and is the body evil or not? And the second question, how does the mind and the body relate, are not separate questions, but you need to answer the second in order for you to answer the first. Because what it is perhaps we can come to an agreement that there's a moral quality to the mind. The mind can choose, and by establishing this, we have to go on to ask the second question. What's the relationship then between the mind, which we've established can choose, and its relationship with the body? Because if there really is a relationship, and if they really are intimately bound, then we can say that the body itself is a moral agent. So the body is not indifferent if the body and the mind are bound together. So perhaps the question is, what do you think is the view of the mind-body relationship in Christianity? Because my challenge would be that the body doesn't seem to be neutral. At least if it was neutral, it seems difficult to imagine why Christ is embodied and why this embodiment seems so important to Christ.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the initial response to the situation is really to just ask, well, what exactly is the reason for Christ being embodied in man? And it's essentially this, is that humans can interact with him and understand more about the divine through him. Like, if God came down as a spirit, he would not have been able to be interacting with humans and go on the cross in the same way that he did, such that the flesh is a secondary and the mind being the primary, perhaps. And it's not, I have to admit, I don't have a full necessarily a full understanding or theory for exactly how the two interact, but rather we know that they two exist, perhaps in some, at least in anecdotal sense, and that we know that they both interact, and that is sufficient, I would say, for our first discussion, perhaps. Okay. How it works is not necessarily important, at least to me.
Okay, so under this, it would be that what is important for Christ is not necessarily its embodiment, but the embodiment is the medium through which we can commune with other people. So somehow the flesh is in the mind, or do you think that that's impossible?
Do you think it's possible? You lagged out.
Okay. Do you think it's possible for us to commune in the mind, as you said, because it is the embodiment of Christ that allows us to interact with him? And it does seem to me, under our view of the mind, seems like we can directly be in contact and interact with the spirit of the good, or of Christ, or of God?
Well, I would say that as current stage as we are now, the physical stage isn't necessary for us to interact, because you can't make voice without the physical. But rather that there is a potential for perhaps discussion or interaction of souls, perhaps, and that might be the more traditional and the better way to understand the Christian lens, perhaps. That there is indeed a realm of the souls, perhaps. And the best way to illustrate that or think about it, perhaps, would be when Odysseus goes down into Hades. It's not necessarily the Christian analogy, but rather that might just be a good way to picture it. He goes in and sees multiple souls. And that might just be a good way to look at the relationship between the two.
Okay. So does the soul rely on the body? Or is the soul completely independent of the body? It's a completely independent.
I would say it's completely independent, but rather that the mode of being in the world is via the body, such that if you took away the body, the soul can still exist, but that would no longer be in the world. That would be in heaven or whatever, your afterlife theology. So there are indeed two stages.
Okay. So the body affects the soul to the extent that it creates a dwelling place for it and situates it inside the world. And it is logically possible, at least, for us to have a different mode of the body, or a different way for the soul to inhabit, and it wouldn't affect how the soul operates, even if that happens. Would that be the case?
I don't know, actually. I think that. Can you repeat a bit of it? Because I don't think I fully understood what you were saying there just now.
Okay. I guess what I think you're arguing for is that we have the body and then we have the soul, and the body and soul is related so long as to the extent that the body provides a dwelling place for the soul in the world, and it situates the soul within the world, allowing it to interact with other embodied beings. However, it seems that it is not there. Those two are not logically related, and you can have a soul with other different ways of situatedness, and they can nevertheless interact with each other, maybe in some other realm, and that would be maybe the Christian relationship between the body and the mind, and perhaps even why there's such a tradition of asceticism in Christianity against the body, because even it's by getting rid of the body somehow that the soul can be situated in another way and to open itself up to other ways of embodiment.
Well, I would say that is a good way to look at it, though I would perhaps suggest that a lot of the Christian argument against the body is perhaps a result of this poorly Platonic formulation in the past. And I think that would be very dangerous to just say the flesh is evil. And that's not something that I want to suggest or illustrate, because I think that dislike for it can very easily lead to hatred, which is not psychologically a very good thing to do. For example, it's the Dostoevsky and maxim. Do not be afraid of human sin, but love man in his sin. That's precisely, perhaps you could say the same with flesh. Do not be afraid of flesh, but rather love flesh in its sin. Not to say that you should love the sin, but rather love and expect and experience it as well.
Well, that almost sounds quite Nietzschean, of this complete love of fate, no matter what happens. And well, I just want to bring back a bit and ask the question of, first, why do you think there was this Platonic detour in Christian thought? And second, why do you think this Platonic detour is wrong? Because there's a lot of great Christian theologians who are also Platonists, and there have been such a great number of attempts to reconcile Christianity and Platonic thought. And why do you think those two, it's a wrong-headed way of approaching Christianity?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that you could perhaps look at it from, I think, just a development of philosophy. Philosophy, almost as a general culture, perhaps, has slowly moved away from Platonism to Aristotelianism. Of course, it happened a bit earlier in Greece than anywhere else, and it's kind of surprising, perhaps, why why the stage took so long for the rest of the world to follow on to the Aristotelianism. But perhaps I think it, and I'm not exactly sure why, and I haven't done much reading about this, but perhaps it's due to the cultural influences of the time that it was very important for them to tie down sin to a certain aspect of the human body without necessarily blaming it on the mind. As such, they said, well, I think the sin or the evilness can lie in the body instead of the mind, because they wanted to leave the mind guilt-free. And in some structure, I'm not necessarily sure about whether that is the case or not, but that's just kind of a hypothesis of mine. But perhaps we could ask the further question to say, perhaps, why do I think it's wrong? I think it's wrong not necessarily in the sense that the entire Platonic structure should be taken down, but more so that the Platonic relationship or the Platonic kind of picture of the evil of the soul is kind of a bit misguided, because there isn't that evidence, I think, for it, and there's not, and as I've said, there's no anecdotal or physical or historical evidence to say that the evil is necessarily down to the body.
Okay, and even it seems that the demonization of the body is a certain, almost finding a quick way out of sin, almost. Since I have a scapegoat here, I can just blame everything on it. And if I become an ascetic, then everything will be fine. So I don't really have to examine my mind as closely. And I guess another idea here is Freud's idea of infantile sexuality, that the mind is not pure, even from a youthful age, but instead it's already contaminated, so to speak, by evil thoughts. Would you agree? How do you think can one situate this idea of infantile sexuality with the body and the development?
I would say that the relationship of sexuality and in Freud, I wouldn't say it's completely misguided, but rather that I think it perhaps interacts on a more kind of psychological plane. For example, I was reading this story called St. Andrew of Crete. It's a Russian story. And essentially, it's basically the Oedipus story, but there's Russian characters. And the question really is that they don't seem apparently copying each other, but they're almost exactly the same thing happens. Apart from the fact that the St. Andrew of Crete, instead of like being shameful as Oedipus at the end, he becomes a bishop. So essentially, I think what it noticed is that there's kind of this question about sexuality in the sense that it's not necessarily wrong, but rather that it is the wrestling with sexuality which has the potential to lead to higher understanding or experience. And that's kind of the same relationship with sin. It's that sin has potential, not necessarily that it's good, but rather that it can lead to further understanding. And it is by wrestling with it which leads to development.
Mm-hmm. So to the extent that sexuality itself is not sinful, and the body, which, because it feels like most of the attack on the body is an attack on the sexuality of the body rather than other things, as we given the Augustinian example. And this discussion of sexuality, what we're trying to say, perhaps bringing back to our broader discussion of the body, is that it's through wrestling with the problems of the body and the desires that it creates and frustrates that we can, just like how we wrestle with sin, that we can, how would you say, get closer to God or bring us closer to goodness?
Well, I think unlike sin, however, is that sexuality isn't intrinsically evil, because I think that is once again a common misnomer, perhaps a straw man raised by the antagonists, like people who disagree with Christianity, that they're like, oh, they just don't like everything. That's definitely not the case, but rather there is a time and place in everything, and that one should not just completely go on a sexual kind of drive for no reason, like just for the sake of it. And then they would say, well, that is perhaps the problem, not necessarily that it is wrong in itself. And as a result, there's a great straw man of the situation. And I think that it is as evident as day that there are problems either psychologically or theologically or morally with certain usages of the sexuality. And I don't think it is even a debatable topic. That's why I think that this entire idea could potentially be an atheist straw man. And they're like, oh, this thing is such a big problem when it actually isn't.
So would even say that, and I think this might be a good place to end. And that somehow we should. There's a good case to be made to return to the Christian view of sexuality as something to be wrestled with compared to the contemporary sexual liberation. And it might be an antidote to a lot of the contemporary, ills that we are facing.
I think that that's definitely true, because I think the only way you can interact or develop is via wrestling, because I really hate this idea where it's like, oh, instead of wrestling with the problem, you should just try everything and then like hope something works and you find something. It's like, well, you shouldn't be like, imagine just drugs, right? You shouldn't go around and saying, well, oh, I don't want to wrestle with drugs. Let me just try everything and then see if something may fit or it may not. Like, you should first wrestle with it before you actually go do it, because if you go do it, it can lead to some horribly harmful experiences in your life. And it's not just about sexuality or drugs, just about every experience in general. Like, if you just go around and try to do everything and throw yourself at everything, you're often going to lead to so many things that you regret, which is just absolutely absurd. And I'm sure you can all think of examples of that in your life. So I think that is a very good place to end it. And I think that kind of touches upon the nature of the soul and the nature of sexuality, perhaps.
Okay, thank you, Josh. I think that's a great place to end.
All right. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. Stay safe, my friends. See you soon, and goodbye. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.